It wasn't the supply chain disruptions. It wasn't the pandemic lockdowns. It wasn't even the war in Eastern Europe. It was the structural insolvency. The arithmetic is merciless. We are witnessing a historical inevitability, a mathematical cul-de-sac. The Federal Reserve is not merely confused, it is cornered. To understand why, we must look backward. The pattern is unmistakable. It appears whenever a hegemon accumulates unpayable debts. The choice is narrow. The walls close in. Eventually, there are no good options left, only painful ones. History provides the roadmap. It shows us exactly what happens when an empire runs out of road. We will examine 3 specific cases, 3 empires that face the exact same dilemma. Rome, Spain, Britain. The timeline differs, the technology changes, but the incentives remain frozen in human nature. The incentive is always to print. The incentive is always to delay. And the result is always a transfer of wealth, from the saver to the state, from the prudent to the profligate. Let us look at the first case study, the Roman Empire, specifically the 3rd century crisis. But the rot started earlier. It began with Nero around 64 AD. The empire had reached peak dominance, but the costs of maintenance were staggering. The legions required payment. The bureaucracy required funding. The public demanded bread and circuses. Taxes could not be raised further without revolt. So Nero chose the monetary shortcut. He reduced the silver purity of the denarius, just a little at first, from 100% to 90%. It seemed like free money, but the incentive to debase is addictive. By the time of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, the currency was collapsing. The silver content plummeted to 50%, then 5%. Eventually, it was merely copper washed in silver. The resulting inflation was catastrophic. Prices soared. Trust evaporated. The middle class was wiped out. Consider the Roman soldier. He fought for a promised pension. By the time he retired, his payout could barely buy a bag of wheat. The flight into hard assets began. Land became the only safety. The social fracture was total. The state survived, but the economy was shattered. Just like Rome. The Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries faced a similar crisis of abundance and mismanagement. Under the Habsburgs, particularly Philip II, Spain controlled a global empire upon which the sun never set. They had access to the vast silver mines of Potosi in the New World. It should have been a golden age of prosperity, but the imperial costs were unsustainable. Constant wars in Flanders, Italy, and against the Ottomans drained the treasury faster than the galleons could replenish it. Instead of developing domestic industry, the Spanish crown relied on the monetary shortcut of imported bullion to pay its debts. The influx of silver did not create wealth, it created the price revolution. Inflation tore through the Iberian Peninsula. The cost of living skyrocketed. A Castilian peasant, once able to feed his family on a modest wage, found himself priced out of basic staples like wheat and fabric. The middle class was hollowed out. As wages failed to keep pace with the soaring cost of goods, wealth fled into unproductive land holdings and church endowments to escape the erosion of currency. The empire defaulted on its debts multiple times, notably in 1557 and 1596, shattering the banking dynasties of Europe and leaving the Spanish economy broken for generations. Just like Spain, the British Empire entered the 20th century as the undisputed financial hegemon, only to find itself trapped by the costs of maintaining that order. The period from 1914 to the 1970s marks the agonizing decline of the British pound sterling. Two world wars decimated the nation's balance sheet. The debt-to-GDP ratio exploded. To manage this burden, the government relied on financial repression and devaluation. The crucial turning point came in 1931 when Britain was forced off the gold standard, defaulting on its obligation to redeem paper for metal. The decline continued into the post-war era. The government maintained low interest rates to service its war debts, punishing savers to bail out the state. This culminated in the 1967 devaluation of the pound, where the Prime Minister famously assured the public that the pound in your pocket had not lost value. This was technically true in nominal terms, but functionally a lie in purchasing power. The British clerk, who had dutifully bought war bonds and saved in sterling, saw his life savings evaporate in real terms. Capital fled the country. The brain drain ensued. The middle class faced a decade of stagnation and stagflation, proving once again that when a sovereign is cornered, the currency acts as the relief valve. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money, where the currency is backed by a tangible asset or strict discipline. Stage 2 is the expansion of public works and social layers, funded by the initial prosperity. Stage 3 is the accumulation of debt, where commitments to military or social programs exceed tax revenue. Stage 4 is the crisis, usually triggered by a war or an economic shock that exposes the insolvency. Stage 5 is the printing press or the digital equivalent, where the central authority creates currency to fill the gap. Stage 6 is the onset of inflation and the loss of faith in the currency. Stage 7 is the collapse of the old order and of forced restructuring, just like Britain in the 20th century. The United States today has entered the late stages of this cycle. The warning signs are flashing red. The national debt has moved vertical, driven by entitlement obligations and interest expenses that now rival the defense budget. The Federal Reserve is trapped in a classic checkmate scenario. If they raise interest rates to fight inflation, they risk crashing the banking system and making the interest on the sovereign debt unpayable. If they lower rates to save the system, they risk reigniting inflation and destroying the currency's purchasing power. Current data suggest we are oscillating between Stage 5 and Stage 6. The flight to hard assets is already visible in the housing market, where prices have detached from wages, and in the central bank accumulation of gold. The incentive structure dictates that the government must inflate away the debt. There is no political will for austerity. Under these constraints, the rational move for the state is to sacrifice the value of the currency to preserve the nominal solvency of the system. Some economic historians note that technology is a powerful deflationary force that could counteract this monetary expansion. They argue that AI and automation will lower costs sufficiently to offset the money printing. While technology does suppress prices, it does not solve the debt overhang. The arithmetic of the sovereign balance sheet remains. If prices fall due to technology, GDP growth slows and tax revenues decline, making the debt burden even heavier in relative terms. The state cannot allow deflation in a debt-based system. Therefore, if technology drives prices down, the central bank will simply print more aggressively to force them back up. The monetary debasement is a feature, not a bug. The resolution of this tension historically follows one of 3 paths. The first endgame is controlled decline, often called financial repression. This occurred in the West after World War II. Interest rates are pegged below the rate of inflation for a decade or more. The debt is liquidated by stealing purchasing power from bondholders and savers slowly, year over year. Anchored in the period from 1945 to 1951, the U.S. Federal Reserve capped yields while inflation ran hot, effectively erasing a large portion of war debt at the expense of the public. The second endgame is chaotic collapse. This happens when the controlled decline spins out of control. Confidence snaps. This is the Weimar Germany scenario of 1923, where the currency becomes worthless in a matter of months. In this scenario, the economy stops functioning, supply chains break, and society undergoes a traumatic reset. The third endgame is a formal reset and restructure. This is often the result of a geopolitical shift or a new monetary agreement. A historical example is the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, where the global monetary system was redesigned from the ground up, pegging currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. This usually involves a revaluation of gold or a new reserve asset to restore confidence. The trajectory is set by the debt levels, but the speed is determined by psychology. The only variable is timing and pain.